Above Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies, A Theory of Justice by John Rawls ranks as the single most influential work on political liberalism. It is frequently cited by academics and has even found its way into court decisions. For example, it was cited during Brown v. Board of Education. What this book essentially is a rational, a priori justification for liberal statehood and equality. This is a kind of social contract theory similar to that formulated by Immanuel Kant. In fact, it basically is Kant's theory, but with an additional principle meant to guarantee social justice and some additional interpretations of the implications of rational self-interest. The theory of justice that Rawls is expositing is called justice as fairness, which argues that a state is only just if it distributes rights and duties equally. Rawls begins from what he calls the original position, which is man in a state of nature. These men in the original state are abstract, rational persons who do not actually have any qualities and formulate their beliefs de novo behind the veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance posits that these abstract persons cannot know what position they will hold in society or what kind of person they will be, whether they will be rich or poor, ruler or ruled, white or black, and so on. Rawls argues that these propositions will inexorably lead to the adoption of a maximally just society. He argues that from the original position, people would choose according to rational self-interest. Therefore, they would choose equal liberties because they would want to maximize their personal goods, which include rights, liberties, wealth, beliefs, and so on. This is the first principle. The second principle he derives is the difference principle, which states that inequality is only permissible to the extent that it benefits the least well-off in society. He argues that this will result from rational self-interest as well, since from behind the veil of ignorance, no one can know whether they would be part of the lowest strata. Now that I've summarized the basic points of this theory, I will move on to my criticisms. First, I must note an elementary critique of the social contract, whether it be Rawlsian, Rousseauian, or Kantian. The validity of the social contract is contingent upon a universal faculty of human reason. This theory assumes that every human is a rational animal, in the words of Aristotle. In other words, every human has the ability to reason as a consequence of his nature. In contrast, postmodernists give us an alternative view, which is that reason and rationality are specifically a Western method of confronting the world and ascertaining truth, one out of many others. This comes in contrast to the other modalities of truth such as magic, shamanism, tests or ordeals, and customs. There is thus a sharp distinction between rational and irrational modes of truth. This implies that reason itself is an invention, that it is not a universal or natural faculty, but rather a method which has been invented at various points in time by different people. The fact that we cannot point to any articulation of reason before the Greeks indicates this, as does the persistence of irrational truth-making in primitive tribes like Papua New Guinea or the famous cargo cults of the Pacific Islanders. If there is no universal human faculty of reason, then proposing that humans, by their nature, can convene in a state of nature to agree upon a rational contract of rights and duties is impossible. The state of nature would imply irrationality, not rationality. Second, Rawls makes many assumptions which are open to critique regarding what people in the state of nature or the original position would choose. First of all, Rawls assumes that these people are rationally self-interested individuals and will not consider questions of metaphysical truth in the abstract, group cohesion and representation in the abstract, or other truths and values. But there's no reason to make this assumption at all. Consequently, the type of society produced under the veil of ignorance might not actually line up with the other principles of Rawls's liberalism, such as the fairness principle, and if the fairness principle fails, then the difference principle also fails. Rawls's definition of justice is basically just an assumption, so one can easily operate from the rational position that inequality is justice instead, such as in the traditional conception of suum cuique, which states to each his own. The purpose is to order differences in qualities between people based on a higher metaphysical principle, which is sensible to some extent in Christianity and other religions, but which has its more explicit basis in the Hindu concept of dharma, or purpose. In other words, it is somewhat irrespective of which religion you have, being an element of pure metaphysics. This principle is the differentiation of the absolute into multiplicity, which necessarily would result in a hierarchy. We can thus avoid the problem of religious particularism. The purpose this serves in our critique is mainly just an alternative view of justice than the one Rawls prefers. It fulfills the same function, which is to resolve conflicts over rights and freedoms, but in a way that does not require a standard of fairness. A hierarchical society does not violate Rawls's requirements that a proposition must be general and universal. It's general because it's based on the principle of natural law, and it's universal because it applies to everyone in society. To argue on this point does not necessitate a sense of the good, because it is purely a question of an a priori truth. But we could base this on a good, something which I will comment on shortly, whereby people could come to an agreement about a society based on unequal categories, on the premise that castes satisfy personal beliefs about human nature. Thus, despite the veil of ignorance, it's still possible for there to result an illiberal society of an unevenness of rights, as all persons might wish for the creation of a traditional order, regardless of what station they would hold, simply because that order is true. Now, Rawls asserts that in the original state, no one would have a conception of good because they are without information about the particularities of concrete persons, such as their beliefs. But to prefer self-benefit, or to prefer even the maximalization of all possible goods, is in itself a conception of good and of belief. Rawls, then, cannot rationally exclude knowledge of a conception of good from the original state. Now, Rawls assumes that people would always choose a form of justice that distributes goods to the lowest strata of society. But if we consider that the question of the stability of a social order as part of the definition of justice, something Rawls in fact does, the distribution of great economic power and political rights to the lower strata might constitute a situation that enables or foments revolution, therefore destroying the social order and rendering it unjust. We consequently also have no reason to assume that the original position would produce a principle of equal rights. The original people who are deciding the structure of society would have every reason to conceive of a society that is as resistant as possible to turmoil and upheaval. Such a society may be highly restrictive of liberties for the sake of liberty and stability, and as Rawls states, it is just to restrict liberties when they contradict the liberties of others. If the liberty to cross over class distinctions destabilize a society, then we might have a reason to restrict it. Third, Rawls is careful to differentiate between his social contract theory and that of Kant. But I think it would be fruitful to address Kant's argument as well, because if I want to steelman Rawls's position, I should assume that his propositions are pretty much based on Kant as a foundation, since Rawls is vague on certain points. Kant asserts that it is the relationships of reason inherent to the idea of a contract that determines its legitimacy, not a historical act like the signing of a physical document. So in other words, Rawls pretty much agrees with the abstract character of contractualism, but he doesn't explain why it's valid. Kant does. The extension of the contract to the rights and duties of men is assumed to take place in rational individualistic terms. Kant states that it would be irrational for a person to accept lesser privileges than another class. This is foundational in the universal right of freedom, which Kant defines as the right to perform actions with respect to the actions of others. In other words, one right of freedom only extends to the right that it does not conflict with the rights of others. Thus, the duties and privileges in society must be distributed in such a way that they do not create exclusivities, since an exclusivity would abridge the freedom of underprivileged classes and constitute a contradiction of rights. But we can, of course, interrogate Kant's notion of rational fairness. His theory of state asserts that limitations on freedom are justified for the preservation of freedom. A state, however, implies that there will be inequality in privileges, as Hegel notes, since there is a division between the rulers and the ruled. Therefore, any state at all violates the fairness principle. Since a state cannot be said to be rationally fair, this means that a social contract must either be anarchistic, like the non-aggression principle, or Stefan Molyneux's universally preferable behavior, or it must admit to the legitimacy of unfairness for the sake of preserving freedom through stability. In the latter case, we must reject Kant's definition of freedom. We have to note that anarchism does not necessarily mean the same thing as egoism. Rawls argues that egoism can't be entertained in the original state because it isn't universalizable and would lead to the violation of other people's liberties. But to return to Kant, we could argue that the exercise of one's will, which Kant defines as practical reason, only takes place in a positive context, i.e., one must have the capacity and opportunity to will something. Thus, freedom in the negative Kantian sense does not exist. If freedom is positive, then the state is well justified in establishing uneven privileges and duties for the sake of both individual and group benefit as part of the ruling class. In that way, we can actually justify the state through a social contract. The traditional concept of freedom usually meant belonging to a group or race, since this is what enabled the expression of one's personality and actions. The state is an extension of this idea, and so a social contract might easily be formed on the basis that certain people must make a sacrifice in prosperity and rights for the benefit of the state, and thus of freedom in the positive sense. But of course, we must note that Rawls, like Kant, is relying on a negative conception of liberty. Rawls deliberately handwaves away the problem of negative versus positive liberty, even though it has important implications for his fairness principle and the justifications for the state. Thus, my criticisms equally apply to his conception of negative liberty. Basically, the problem is that Rawls said very little on the justification for the state. Now, I'll proceed with a somewhat weak criticism. The method of Rawls, which is to employ logic to reason from certain a priori premises, is not airtight. It's true that we cannot critique the specific logic that Rawls presents empirically, such as by, for example, pointing out that inequality does not actually exist in the real world, and so there cannot be abstract equal persons, or that there is no such document as the social contract that people sign. But we can argue whether the decision to actually employ this logical method actually gets at any concrete truths that exist in the real world, which are extremely relevant for the task of building a state and achieving a particular definition of justice. After all, the whole point of proposing a rational theory of justice is to achieve a particular vision for society. In other words, we can and should critique the premises of Rawls's method. Since it doesn't derive anything from axiomatic first principles, there's no sense in which we absolutely must accept the reasonings of Rawls. A very recent line of critique against Rawls comes from the left, where they argue that this abstract conception of equality and justice ignores the actual means by which power actors oppress people. Therefore, these abstractions are powerless to confront and reverse this oppression. The supposed impact of the legacy of slavery is presented to demonstrate that developing an abstract theory of fairness as justice is not enough to actually bring justice to marginalized groups. It would be necessary to consider the ways in which society is slanted against certain groups and the mechanisms used to accomplish this such that they can be reversed through an active policy of remediation, which would be unequally applied. The kind of welfare proposed by Rawls is only of a universalistic sort, and as such, it cannot perform this function. Thus, from a leftist point of view, Rawls's theory of justice doesn't go far enough in achieving true equality. The veil of ignorance makes us ignorant of forms of oppression that are based on group identity, implicit bias, and horizontal social treatment. In other words, it is a question of what Foucault calls infrapower, not necessarily just the structure of the state or economy. To address infrapower would require the state to deliberately make laws of unequal treatment, violating the principles of Rawls's justice as fairness. Now, Rawls does actually address these questions to some degree, calling this the problem of redress. His answer is simply that the difference principle aims at the elevation of the most disadvantaged, and so in that way it partially performs redress. But a positive redress is only one aspect of racial justice, since the leftist theory of systemic racism posits that white people have gained primarily through exploitation. Thus, a program of genuine redress would have to confiscate the proceeds of that exploitation to truly bring a balance of justice. But Rawls disagrees, arguing that a violation of the well-being of the well-off impedes their liberty, and that the degree to which we redistribute wealth must be contingent upon an improvement of both groups, i.e., the well-off must be allowed to continually accumulate wealth. We can see how this argument is unsatisfactory for the left, since it tends to preserve privilege. From a right-wing perspective, we can easily see how Rawls's theory of justice can have an oppressive effect on native populations. Behind the veil of ignorance, we must assume that any one of us could be an immigrant or a foreigner. Therefore, we have to grant to foreigners the same rights, privileges, and duties as we grant to everyone else. This would imply a right of immigrants to vote, become politicians, or attain welfare. However, in a very real way, this constitutes an abuse of the general will, an obscuration of the national interest, as well as a violation of self-determination and a general form of expropriation of native wealth. In the first place, the interests of native populations can be orthogonal to immigrant populations. Native workers usually want higher wages, and immigration depresses wages. However, immigrants are more likely to tolerate this fact as they can comparatively benefit more from the jobs they acquire. If immigrants had the ability to vote, they would vote for politicians who implement open borders policies and promote multiculturalism and anti-racism. Thus, if the native population wants to remain ethnically homogeneous and benefit from nationalist economics, their vote would be gradually drowned out by the immigrants. The general will then ceases to exist because the general will assumes a unified population. Rawls's justice then actually ends up preserving group conflicts that exist in actual societies. Just as the leftists point out, the veil of ignorance makes us ignorant of identities, and identity is a fundamental part of human nature which drives group conflicts. If we cannot engage with these group conflicts because we ascribe to this universalistic standard of equality, then we have to justify or ratify injustices that can peel apart nations and lead to intergroup violence, such as the increasing acquisition of land and jobs by immigrants. In the end, it doesn't matter if you propose abstract standards of equality when the phenomenon of group conflict tends to override our abstract values. Abstractions then only have value insofar as they actually consider power relationships between groups and thus actually describe reality. Next, we must interrogate the first principle of Rawls' society, which is the implications of a guarantee of liberty. There arises a conflict that Robert Nozick points out between liberty and the difference principle, which is that state redistribution of wealth contradicts the right of persons to voluntary use of their property. Rawls does not conceive of liberty as implying a right to the exercise of and entitlement to property, but there is no reason to assume this. If we're honest with ourselves, then liberty implies some form of voluntary ownership, whether we arrive at that through some argument of self-ownership, which I think is very weak due to the unjustified modernist assumption of an autonomous self, or through some other argument, such as John Locke's or Kurt Doolittle's. Since the liberty principle overrides the difference principle, it's impossible to justify any form of redistribution or socialism. If you look to the probable inspiration for Rawls's conception of liberty in Kant, we can see that Kant defines liberty as a right that does not infringe upon the rights of others. Property, where it is a voluntary acquisition, in no way infringes upon others' rights, and so we can derive the proposition that the state should protect and not infringe upon the property rights of owners. Further, according to Rawls's formulation of the principle of liberty, property should be inviolable. But we also have another problem. If rulers have rights over the property of the ruled, then we can say that the distribution of freedoms and rights has become unequal, and this would violate the first principle of a Rawlsian society, which is the same problem we have just said exists in Kant's social contract. For Rawls to conceive of the kind of society that he wants, he would have to subordinate liberty to the difference principle, but instead, the liberty principle takes priority over the difference principle. We must now also make a minor criticism of Rawls's work, which is not in any way fundamental. Rawls's conception of natural duties is contingent upon the principle of fairness assumed through the veil of ignorance. In other words, because abstract persons cannot have qualities, they would propose that the definition of justice would be fairness, or consistency in the application of rules to individuals. Following this, Rawls derives that we obtain certain obligations based on quote-unquote natural duties that follow from the principle of fairness. However, we have just shot down the notion that a veil of ignorance necessitates that people choose fairness. Abstract persons may not have qualities, but they can sense that concrete persons do. I will call this the knowledge of inequality. This is actually the whole reason why Rawls thinks these abstract persons would not choose unfairness, because they can imagine how their lives would be if they were an underprivileged class. This implies that they have some knowledge about human inequality. We can subvert Rawls's position, however. The knowledge of inequality carries a whole range of implications for the outcomes of society and its persons. An unstable society cannot be good for individuals. If we know that certain inequalities cannot be solved, such as, for example, IQ disparities, and if we have the knowledge that low IQ leads to more violent crime, then we might arrive at a position where individuals decide that the rights should be unequal to prevent or mitigate crime. This does not violate the veil of ignorance because an abstract person with the knowledge of inequality can imagine himself as a low IQ criminal despite not actually having any qualities, and therefore reason that it would be good for him if the state prevented him from committing crimes. Therefore, there's good reason for the abstract persons in the original position to reject fairness. We have already established this through another argument, but since there might not be a principle of fairness, we cannot say that there are any necessary natural duties that originate from the social contract. To elaborate on this, Rawls argues that these duties originate from a value of fair reciprocity that comes from social cooperation, i.e., it is unfair to be a free rider, so one must adhere to cooperative obligations. One could easily raise Kant's categorical imperative as a solution for deriving natural obligations from pure reason without the fairness principle, but it nevertheless has some inconsistencies. The broadness or narrowness of the moral proposition in question is completely arbitrary, and this fact can be used to justify actions that in any other system, and which according to intuition would be immoral. For example, as one commenter on this question said, everyone should tell the truth except for one lie. We can similarly universalize certain immoral acts that are not zero-sum games, such as, for example, all people should SA another person. We can also propose perfectly inoffensive involuntary actions that cannot be universalized, such as everyone should use contraception. This last example would violate Rawls's first principle. Kant's objection to this is that other moral values must be considered, but if that is the case, then the categorical imperative is not sufficient in itself to give us a consistently moral set of obligations. Since reason is insufficient to create a morally consistent system, duties must then be a consideration of either intuition, in which case the obligations are completely arbitrary and might not necessarily be fair, or of higher values, in which case obligations must be contingent upon a hierarchical notion of justice, since moral commandments as a higher law implies a sovereign. It would therefore not be fair. Now I must address Rawls's version of the paradox of tolerance. He states that according to the principle of equal liberties, the first principle, intolerant organizations are disallowed from participating politically because they must proposition the elimination of the rights of others, thus depriving them of equal liberty. Now, we obviously assume a right of equal political participation under the first principle, so what this argument boils down to is the right of equal participation should be restricted by the right to equal participation. It is a tautology. We could say the same for Rawls and Kant's definition of liberty, which is liberty must be restricted by liberty, or in other words, the right to action must be restricted by the right to action. We can therefore argue that these principles, as they have been defined, are irrational. I'll admit that I did not read this book in its entirety. If there are any arguments that Rawls made that address the problems I proposed in this video, then you can leave a comment below and I might respond to it. Rawls himself said that the major theoretical points and arguments of this book are found in the first 4 chapters, which I did read in their entirety. I skimmed the rest of the book, which seemed to mostly consist of procedural questions that don't have much relevance to the theoretical foundation of its contractual society, which is what I am most interested in critiquing rather than the specifics of his liberal society. For example, he has chapters dedicated to the distribution of goods under the difference principle. There's a chapter elaborating on the definition and nature of goods. There's a chapter on constitutional conventions and democracy. None of these necessarily are relevant to the core theoretical thesis of this book, and really seems to be a practical interest mostly to people who will accept this theory and desire its implementation. But the general overall point I want to make is that none of Rawls's propositions are foundational on axiomatic first principles. His assertion that people would choose fairness is based on 1, a preferential definition of justice as fairness, which is kind of just his opinion, man, and 2, the assumption that abstract persons will employ rational self-benefit and desire the maximum amount of goods. These assumptions are simply that, assumptions. They do not require us to accept this reasoning. In fact, much of this book's theory is foundational on assumptions. Rawls assumes here or there that people will be roughly equal, or that people will not desire to be all that intolerant, or that people will come to an agreement in the original position rather than to each have their own individualistic conception of justice, and so on. Since these are assumptions, you can just dismiss them without an argument. Rawls does not provide a genuine reason why these assumptions should be followed, other than that they are implied by fairness. But this is just to say that his assumption justifies his other assumptions. We have in no way established that these assumptions are true. But the truth of metaphysics, for example, is incontrovertible for the simple reason that relativism is absurd. Therefore, what I have said about the rejection of the fairness principle on metaphysical grounds is more true to propose than the many assumptions presented by Rawls. I will say that other than a few instances of incongruences, Rawls's theory is actually pretty rationally consistent, an advantage his work has over Popper's. Rawls makes Popper look stupid. As such, I have a great amount of respect for this book, but I still think that, like Popper, the author is too concerned with the self-preservation of liberalism to really claim that he supports democracy, and this also requires him to utilize a quite irrational argument to self-justify the system. We can say that the logical consequence of his own paradox of tolerance means that the system wouldn't be democratic in the strict sense of that word, since it discounts the general will. But one strength of Rawls, at least, is that his theory is contractarian rather than explicitly democratic. In other words, he can say that his system is self-government since it relies on an abstract form of consent. In a way, you could conceive of the original position as a kind of general will. But to present managed democracy as if it were a consistently rational example of equal liberty is nonetheless laughable.